Good evening, Ottawa Bible Church. This is Pastor Dakota, and we are in day 5 of our devotional series called Shepherding Moments, where we've been analyzing the 7 churches in Revelation. So far, we've covered the church in Ephesus, who is being told and commanded by Jesus to overcome a cold and loveless heart. See, their walk with God had become so truth-based, but devoid of passion and real zeal and real love for Jesus in an intimate way, that their walk with God was going through the motions and becoming mechanical. We get to the church in Smyrna, which is what we've covered. In the church in Smyrna, we're being commanded by God, overcome persecution, overcome tribulation, overcome the trial, make it to the end. You're going to be martyrs, but make it to the end. We know that the church in Pergamum, we know that they were having to overcome false teachers. Jesus was saying, overcome this. And then here we are to the message to the church in Thyatira. Because there's a much larger volume of verses with the church of Thyatira. We're just going to be covering verses 18 through 20 tonight. And tomorrow I'll follow up with the rest of the passage. But let's just read one verse at a time. Verse 18 says, "And to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and his feet are like burnished bronze," says this. You know, Jesus always gives a description of himself before he's about to address a church. And he gives a description of himself because his attributes, his characteristics, the truths of who he is the remedy to solve any problem in any church. If a church looks to Jesus, the author and the finisher of their faith, they're going to overcome. Looking to Jesus as he can make provision for us in our need is the answer to overcome anything. And what Jesus is claiming right here in this description is that he has eyes like a flame of fire. Eyes in this type of literature in the Bible is often associated with omniscience, God's ability to know everything. And then fire is often paralleled with judgment or testing. And it's almost as if Jesus is saying, I'm the omniscient one who perfectly tests and who perfectly judges. And he reiterates that point when he says, his feet are like burnished bronze. You know, in this culture, if you were someone who was working with precious metals outside, your feet would turn bronze because either the residue from the metals themselves would fall on you, the sun itself would tan your feet, but either way it showed that you had been outside with enough experience and that you had the credibility to make judgments in this line of work, that you were found to be faithful. Well, it's almost as if Jesus is saying here that he's the one who's credible to make judgments. He's the one with eyes of a flame of fire and with feet that are burnished bronze. And by the way, we know that bronze is a picture in the Bible of judgment as well. He stands on solid ground. His judgments are right. They're not counterfeit. There's no crack in the foundation of Jesus's opinions. He's standing tall, and he himself is the remedy to overcome anything. And we get here to verse 19, and Jesus says this to the church, I know your deeds and your love and faith and service and perseverance, and that your deeds of late are greater than at first. That word for deeds is the same word for works, works of righteousness. And what I think the deeds are is the very thing we're given in the list. The word love, the word faith, the word service, the word perseverance. If we do a word study on each of those, it's broken down like this. Jesus is saying, I know your agape love. I know your selfless, sacrificial, unconditional love that you share to the world and to your own congregation. I know your love. Then he goes on to say, I know of your faith. That word faith is an idea of active trust in the one who can save. Not just a mental understanding of what you believe, but one where you believe it so much that it affects your lifestyle. I know your faith is solid. Then he goes on to say, I know your service. The word there is the same word we have for ministry. I know your service. I know your ministry. You're involved in the ministry and you're faithful with it. I know your perseverance. The word here is the same word for endurance or long suffering. Actually, in the original language, it's the word hupomene, which means to bear up under the weight of a heavy object. Have you ever been requested by a friend to help them move into their new apartment or to a new home? And you get there and they've got nothing packed in boxes. And then you get to their new location and they didn't tell you that they have a 2-story home where you need to bring their heaviest valuables up those steps. Oh, and by the way, when you showed up, you found out that you were like one of only 2 other people to help in the entire process. You get up those steps, you're holding that 500-pound dresser, it seems like, and you're starting to shake underneath the weight of that object, and you know that you have two choices. Either you can shake so much and you can quit and you can let that object or that valuable fall and it break, and what's valuable is no longer valuable. Or you can bear up under the weight. You can give it all you have. You can do squats. You can use your legs. You can use your shoulders, use your muscles. And at the end of the day, because you didn't quit, because you bared up under the weight of your circumstance, you were said to have endurance or perseverance. See, this church has these qualities taking place in them. And then verse 19 finishes by saying, and your deeds in these areas are greater than they were at first. So they're growing as a church in faithfulness. But verse 20, Jesus says this, almost in stark contrast. You got to listen to it. But I have this against you. I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray so that they commit acts of immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. You know, Jezebel was an Old Testament character where she was the queen of King Ahab, where they almost outlawed worship of Yahweh and they promoted the worship of Baal, a false god. She tempted many of God's people to sexual sin and idolatry. In fact, she even murdered many of the Lord's prophets, and she persecuted Elijah, and it was just not a good scene. We know that she died. She was thrown off the ledge of a building, and the prophecy was fulfilled that dogs would eat up her body and lick her blood. It's crazy. But this was not a character who was anything associated with righteousness in the Old Testament. This was the literal character. So now Jesus is bringing up the characterization of what she lived like. Just as Jezebel in the Old Testament lived and was known for these attributes, so you put up with a spirit that's just like that in your church, he's saying to the church in Thyatira. He's saying those same attributes of Jezebel, you're putting up with it. In fact, the word here is you're tolerating it. In other words, you're suffering along with it. You're allowing yourself to suffer through this affliction when you don't have to. In other words, the spirit of Jezebel, the one who calls herself a prophetess, that spirit, that lifestyle should have been kicked out a long time ago in your fellowship. But you've reached a point where you've been okay with these things and they've affected your holiness. You know, church family, I want to let you know that one of the greatest things that God will judge our men by is by our personal purity, by our personal soul care, by having an integrity of heart, by having a clean conscience. And I know the statistics on online addictions and sexual sin and pornography and things of that nature. And I don't mean to speak about something, you know, where little kids may be viewing this right now. I don't mean to get into an over amount of detail, but here's what it comes down to. As men, we need to lead our church. As men, we need to lead our homes. As men, we need a clean conscience. Shame will never be a good motivator to overcome sin. If this is something you're wrestling with, if this is something you're struggling with grace and with mercy and with love, if you know a brother who's walking with Jesus, talk to him. Make sure you're not alone in these types of struggles, but these are not things that can go unknown and just hidden under the rug. The statistics are out there that a number of people wrestle in this way, and I just want to encourage you, let God use you as an empty vessel for ministry. Let him, if this is the case in your life, let him overcome these things in your life. Let there be no clog between the fellowship between you and Jesus. But in fact, find a brother who you trust. Make it a point to get discipled. Confess your sin to one another. Come before Jesus and say, God, I'm tired of doing this alone. I need help. And at the end of the day, Ottawa Bible, here's the thing that I'm calling us together as men to do. As men, I'm calling us towards a clean conscience always. The reward of a clean conscience, there's nothing like it. I'm calling us to lead our families. I'm calling us to jump into ministry. I'm calling us to be used by God ultimately. So with that being said, this is just a word of encouragement to walk with Jesus. And in this downtime, where we're identifying so many of the vain things we used to do, let it be true of us that this downtime, this season through COVID-19, it reoriented our lives towards what's important and kind of refreshed and refueled our desire to meet with Jesus, with King Jesus, who alone can satisfy the longing of my heart. unlike any other counterfeit pleasure ever could. Church family, thank you so much for listening. Tomorrow we start day 6 with the rest of the church in Thyatira. I love you. I miss you so much. Have a good evening. Bye.